Hello, BookTube, and welcome to week 2 of our mandatory read-along of Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice. The mandatory part I'd like to underscore just a little. Some of you seem to be a little unclear on the concept. People saying, I might join in, or people saying, well, you're only 15 chapters in, I might join if I have the time. People even saying, sacrilege. Could they stop? Do they have permission to stop? I'm not sure that everybody's quite on point with what the word mandatory means. You have to read this book, and not only that, you have to love it. Okay? but anyway, the 15 chapters that we're reading today really kick the beehive. Things start to boil up. Things start to get interesting. In the beginning of the book, we meet all of our principal characters, almost. There's Lady Catherine de Bourgh we don't meet yet, but we meet most of our principal characters. Including Elizabeth Bennet and her sister Jane, the two smartest and prettiest sisters of the 5 daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, who are at Longbourn, and who are Mrs. Bennet is in a flutter because A, she wants to get her daughters married off so that they're secure in life, and B, the main reason she wants to do that is because the Longbourn estate is entailed away from the Bennet family. When Mr. Bennet dies, Longbourn will go to a male cousin. It cannot go to any of the daughters. And the male cousin is Mr. Collins, an oily, dim-witted, extremely laughable curate from Hunsford Parish. He's from the same parish, the same neighborhood as Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is his patroness and who he feels an excessive dog's body devotion to. He will inherit Longbourn. Doesn't seem fair to Mrs. Bennet, or I admit to most readers of this book. And even in Jane Austen's day, an estate owner a little bit more energetic or avaricious than Mr. Bennet would probably have found a way around such an entail. People did all the time. They weren't ironclad acts of God. But we meet the Bennet girls. We meet their neighbors, the Lucases, and we meet some wealthy gentlemen. Netherfield Hall, in the neighborhood of Longbourn, is finally let by a young man named Mr. Bingley, a pleasant, open-faced young man who has a good fortune, £5,000 a year, and who, at various meetings in the first 15 chapters, is immediately smitten by Jane Bennet, and she by him. They form a connection right away. And Mr. Bingley comes in tow with his friend, Mr. Darcy, who's even wealthier, twice as wealthy, but who has a kind of icy disdain for the local surroundings. You get the sense that he's more comfortable in the drawing rooms of London than he is out in the countryside. And he makes that clear. He makes his disdain so clear, in fact, that even Mrs. Bennet, who is on the eagle-eyed lookout for matches for her daughters, has nothing good to say about Mr. Darcy, just condemns him as soon as the first ball is over. In the chapters that we're reading today, we get a much more intimate introduction to Mr. Wickham. He is part of the militia that is encamped at Meryton, right near to Longbourn. They're smart, well-dressed, red-coated soldiers, just like the redcoats that attacked America. And Mr. Wickham has everything in his favor. He has a wonderful demeanor. He has a charming way with words, wonderful eye contact, and he's also very handsome. He's a very handsome young man. And the girls, the Bennets, are to one degree or another taken with him. Not Jane. She has eyes only for Bingley, all the way from the beginning. But Elizabeth, our smart Eliza, has eyes for Mr. Wickham. She's delighted when he dances with her. She's delighted when he notices her. And she is delighted, but then by turns furious and heartbroken when he confides in her the story of his life, which it turns out is deeply connected with the story of Mr. Darcy. It turns out that they were boyhood friends. They were born in the same parish. They ran around in the same park. Mr. Wickham's father was an estate manager for Mr. Darcy's father. And old Mr. Darcy took a special liking to young Wickham and promised him a very prosperous church living that was in his gift. One of the parishes in the vast Pemberley estates had its own master, much in the way that Mr. Collins is. And when that master grew old and died, that living would go to Wickham, young as he is. He'd be set for life. He'd have a very good, solid income, a respectable job. The church livings here are not what the Roman Catholic idea is. There was no religious calling to the church. Instead, it was a very good living. It was a very good job to get, and it was in the gift of the people on whose lands the parishes were. So, Mr. Wickham could look forward to that, but it turns out that young Wickham was denied that when old Mr. Darcy died. This is a story that he tells Elizabeth Bennet. To her shock, she's trembling with rage. She wasn't a fan of Mr. Darcy to begin with. This just makes things worse, incalculably worse, because Wickham tells the story of his own disenfranchisement. It says that when old Mr. Darcy died, young Mr. Darcy, our Mr. Darcy, refused to honor the agreement, and as he tells Elizabeth Bennet, there wasn't enough particular for him to have any redress at law. There was no legal way to do it. He was just denied a good thing that would have been his by Mr. Darcy, out of spite. That's what we're told. It doesn't take long after that first initial story for Jane Austen, in the mouths of some of her characters, to raise doubts. Like, for instance, Jane Bennet raises doubts, specifically by saying, how could Mr. Darcy be so evil and still be Mr. Bingley's friend? She doesn't care much about Darcy. She just refuses to believe anything, even remotely negative, about Mr. Bingley. And that makes the subsequent developments in these chapters all the more heartbreaking. But between those developments and that moment, there is a ball. There's a great big ball. And a lot of stuff happens at that ball. It's a bravura piece of writing on Jane Austen's part. I know that's a little bit ridiculous to say, but never, because she's really good at all times. But her description of the ball is really good, really brings you there and keeps you there. Gives you a sense not only of the delights, but also of the endurance factor involved in these things. And Darcy is at the ball, and Mr. Bingley is at the ball. Mr. Wickham declines to be there. He's not there. The girls are looking forward to dancing with him, Elizabeth especially, but Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are there, and so is everybody else. There's a ball, there's a dinner. It's a whole entertainment extravaganza, and a lot happens. There's a lot of subtlety rippling through that chapter. It's an amazing, amazing moment. For instance, Darcy dances with Elizabeth. He asks to dance with her and has a dance with her in which the conversation is excruciatingly awkward. He doesn't want to talk, and she doesn't want to let him not talk. And she's also so full of Mr. Wickham's story that she can't stop herself from alluding to it, even though it's a gross imposition on the courtesy of the day to bring up this story in a place, in a setting, and in an intimate way in which Darcy cannot possibly respond. She can't help herself, because she feels like this guy ruined this very attractive young man that she's starting to feel great affection for. But the ball has lots of other signature happenings too. For instance, Darcy is affronted. He tries his best to control himself, but he's affronted by Elizabeth Bennet's mentions of Wickham. He's affronted by her obvious belief that he was the bad guy in the story. And at the same moment, almost, that he becomes affronted by that realization, he also sees that Jane and Bingley can't take their eyes off each other. That they dance alone together, they talk alone together all throughout the day. They're having their own separate ball. They're barely involved with anyone else. They're so caught up with each other. And also there's a horrifyingly uncomfortable scene where Mrs. Bennet is talking about, among other things, the relationship between Jane and Bingley as if it were already a marriage, as if they were already married. And she's not just talking about that in terms of, oh, how pleasant that would be. She's talking about the material advantages. He has this much money. They're this close to Longbourn, so I'll be able to see them all the time. And it's weird. It is described to us that she is behaving abominably and audibly. Elizabeth Bennet is pleading with her over and over again. What is the use of talking so that Darcy can hear you say these things? Why make an enemy of him? Why do this? It is, in fact, in other words, a scene. And there are others, too. Mary Bennet, the book-cribbing literature snob in the Bennet family. gets up and sings, and it's not successful at all. And she's compelled brainlessly by the polite applause at the table to do it again. Her father finally has to tell her to stop and give other people a try, but it's horribly awkward. In fact, the Bennets just in general, aside from Jane, make a terrible first impression or second or third impression on a lot of the people that are there. And Elizabeth, of course, is distressed that Wickham is not there. She had been planning on dancing with him many times during the evening. Instead, her first 2 dances go to Mr. Collins. And that's pretty grotesque. It comes as no surprise to the reader by this point, even this early in the book, that Mr. Collins cannot dance. He is horrible at it. So not only is he oily and disgusting in his conversation, which is all about Lady Catherine de Bourgh and how wonderful she is, but he's also a bad dancer, and that makes the ordeal even worse. Elizabeth can't wait to get rid of him. But she's not done with him yet, because his attentions to her have had a motive. He wants to ask her to be his wife. He wants to ask her father if she can be his wife. It has long occurred to him, he tells her, that since he is going to inherit Longbourn, it would make sense for him to also marry one of the girls in the family. I want to read you. I want to read you his suit to Elizabeth, because it is in my reading the second funniest example of this kind of thing anywhere in English literature. This is what he tells her. He's proposing marriage to her, and this is how he does it. My reasons for marrying are, first, that I think it a right thing for every clergyman in easy circumstance, like myself, to set the example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I am convinced it will add very greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, which perhaps I ought to have mentioned earlier, that it is the very particular advice and recommendation of the very noble lady whom I have the honor of calling patroness. Twice she has condescended to give me her opinion, unasked too, on this subject. It was but the very Saturday night before I left Hunsford, between our pools of quadrille, while Mrs. Jenkinson was arranging Miss de Bourgh's footstool, that she said, "Mr. Collins, you must marry. A clergyman like you must marry. Choose properly, choose a gentlewoman for my sake and for your own. Let her be an active, useful sort of person, not brought up high, but able to make a small income go a good way. That is my advice. Find such a woman as you can. Bring her to Hunsford, and I will visit her. Allow me, by the way, to observe, my fair cousin, that I do not reckon the notice and kindness of Lady Catherine de Bourgh as among the least of the advantages in my power to offer. You will find her manners beyond anything that I can describe, and your wit and vivacity, I think, must be acceptable to her, especially when tempered with the silence and respect which her rank inevitably incite. Thus much for my general intention in favor of matrimony. It remains to be told why my views were directed to Longbourn instead of to my own neighborhood, where I assure you there are many amiable young women. But the fact is that, being as I am to inherit this estate after the death of your honored father, who, however, may live many years longer, I could not satisfy myself without resolving to choose a wife from among his daughters, that the loss of them might be as little as possible when the melancholy event takes place, which, however, as I have already said, may not be for several years. This is a proposal of marriage, keep in mind. This has been my motive, my fair cousin, and I flatter myself that it will not sink me in your esteem. And now, nothing remains for me but to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affection. To fortune I am perfectly indifferent, and shall make no demand on that nature to your father, since I am well aware that it could not be complied with, and that £1,000 in the 4 per cents, which will not be yours till after your mother's decease, is all that you may ever be entitled to. On that head, therefore, I shall be uniformly silent, and you may assure yourself that no ungenerous reproach shall ever pass my lips when we are married. Perfect. Just beautiful. He knows to the exact percentage point how much money will be hers and when and why, and yet he wants her to believe he'll never mention it again. That is the sum and essence of Mr. Collins' suit to Elizabeth Bennet, and it is matched in English literature in terms of the bloodlessness of the thing, the buffoonish comedy of the thing, only, and some of you will see this coming already if you're big fans of English literature, you'll see it's matched and exceeded only by the note of the mash note, the proposal note that Mr. Casaubon writes in Middlemarch. that is, I wish I had it here to read it to you. It is even funnier, and it's shorter, but still, that is superb. And you know already the effect that it's going to have. Elizabeth Bennet wants nothing to do with this creep. And she tells him that. She tells him, I can't possibly do this. And he says, I know the way. I know the game here. You deny me once because you want me to keep trying. And finally, she is as blunt as she possibly can be and says, no, I don't know how to make it any plainer. I am not going to be your wife. That is not going to happen. And Mrs. Bennet immediately finds this out. Mr. Collins withdraws. And he is still saying, kind of, sort of, that he must just renew his suit, that this is all some sort of fan dance. Mrs. Bennet is furious and goes immediately to Mr. Bennet. She breaks into his library and says, you must make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins. There's a crisis here. You have to intervene. He says, very well, summon her down here, have her brought to my library. She comes to the library and he says, well, is it true, my daughter, that Mr. Collins has proposed to you? And Mrs. Bennet says, yes, it is true that he proposed to her, and if she doesn't accept him, I'll never have anything to do with her. I'll never speak to her again. And her father says, a wonderful little moment. Her father says, well, Lizzie, then you have a choice. You can either refuse to marry Mr. Collins and therefore have nothing more to do with your mother, or you can marry him and have nothing more to do with me. And Mrs. Bennet is furious at this. She's just furious at this outright, what she sees as a contemptuous abrogation of Mr. Bennet's duties as a father to see his daughters well married. And the thing, Jane Austen, it's very important when reading Jane Austen to pay attention as much to what she leaves out as to what she puts in. You're supposed to pay attention in her books to a marked degree. In this case, for instance, you are supposed to pretty much know, you're certainly supposed to put two and two together, that Mr. Collins hears all of this. Because when next we see him, he is not only not any longer saying, I will try my suit again, he is upset, huffy, silent, doesn't want anything to do with Elizabeth Bennet. He is scorned. And right at the key moment, Charlotte Lucas of the Lucas family, their neighbors, is right on the spot. And in a move that I'm sure psychologists have a name for, Mr. Collins transfers his affections to Charlotte Lucas. And in very short order, proposes to her. And she accepts him. And she accepts him with her eyes wide open. She is not that much different than Elizabeth Bennet. Even though Mr. Bennet says later on that he had once accredited her with some sense, and now learning that she has none, it's even funnier. But that's not true. She knows exactly what she's doing. And she tells us that in one of the most chilling passages in Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is not a chilling book, generally speaking. But she insists, once she goes to Hunsford as Mr. Collins' wife, she's desperate for visitors, as I think anybody would be. And one of those visitors that she wants is her lifelong friend, Elizabeth Bennet. And she has a moment with Elizabeth. It's amazing. Where they're talking about her being Mr. Collins' wife. And there's no romanticism in it at all. Her reflections were in general satisfactory. Mr. Collins, to be sure, was neither sensible nor agreeable. His society was irksome, and his attachment to her must be imaginary. But still, he would be her husband. Without thinking highly either of men or of matrimony, marriage had always been her object. It was the only honorable provision for well-educated young women of small fortune, and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. This preservative she had now obtained, and at the age of 27, without ever having been handsome, she felt all the good luck of it. The least agreeable circumstance in the business was the surprise it must occasion to Elizabeth Bennet, whose friendship she had valued beyond that of any other person. Think how bleak that is. It's not just surprise, it's pain, it's hurt, it's disillusionment that Elizabeth Bennet feels. And Charlotte Lucas knows that. She knows all of this. She knows what Mr. Collins is and that she doesn't even like him, much less love him. But it's the only preservative from want. It's the only way that she has. What else could she do? 27, she's very close to being what the Regency age, just after when this book was written, would call on the shelf. Unmarriageably old. An offer comes along. Mr. Collins has 2 legs, 2 arms, 2 eyes, and he has a living. He has a solid living. and a wealthy, influential patroness. Charlotte Lucas estimates, probably correctly, that in Meryton she's never going to do any better. And one of the many horrible things that Mr. Collins says to Elizabeth Bennet when they're having their disagreement about whether or not she's going to marry him is that she, too, will probably never get another offer. Certainly not anything like as good. You know, a drayman's wife, a farmhand, a governess, something like that, but not a proper living. There aren't many chilling moments in this book. This is a sparkling comedy, but moments like that remind you of the realities involved here for all the Bennet girls. And I think, as I said last time, and believe me, I'm winding up to a big peroration of the subject in a couple of weeks, I think they also make Mrs. Bennet far more sympathetic than Jane Austen wants her to be. It's not Elizabeth Bennet who's describing her as an embarrassing, self-absorbed, hypochondriac termagant. It's Jane Austen who's describing her that way. And I don't believe her. It's not the only case. There are many cases like that in this book where one familiar thing that happens throughout this book is that people have their opinions of other people changed by circumstance and by reading between the lines and by paying attention to what they already know. And I believe those are good muscles. They will stand us in good stead as we move on in this book. But there are other characters who are introduced in this book, including the Gardners. Mr. Gardner and his wife. Mr. Gardner is Mrs. Bennet's brother, and he and his wife come to Longbourn every Christmas, celebrate Christmas at Longbourn. And Mrs. Gardner is much younger than Mr. Gardner and is a big favorite of the girls, especially Jane and Elizabeth. The three of them make a trio whenever she comes to visit, and she is herself a fascinating character. And she gets more fascinating as the book goes on, and Jane Austen never gives us enough of it. She never tells us anything. Although in the chapters that we're reading today, Mrs. Gardner does confess that she is very familiar with the neighborhood of Pemberley House, where both Wickham and Darcy grew up. She knew it quite well, and she knew the old Mr. Darcy by character quite well. I've always thought there's a lot more to that than meets the eye. I've always thought there was a book there. One way or another, the Gardners, of course, have an idea of traveling, of taking the girls on a little excursion. Wouldn't that be fun? And that idea is floated in these chapters, and a trip is made to the Gardners' home in London, where they meet, among other people, Mr. Darcy. And it's an awkward meeting because there's a horrible thing that has happened at Longbourn. Jane has received a letter telling her that Bingley and his friends have left Netherfield Hall and don't plan to return. They have returned to London. It's all curiously vague, but it seems like Mr. Bingley has forgotten about her. Like his attention and his affections have moved on. This is flatly inconceivable to Elizabeth Bennet. She has seen Jane and Bingley together, and she knows what she saw. And she knows that it can't be faked, and she knows that it can't change. Her faith in that never varies, but Jane is heartbroken. And the ending scene of the chapters that we're reading today is Darcy being confronted with the fact that Jane has been in London. She's been visiting the Gardners. She's been in London. And, isn't it strange that she hasn't seen Bingley? And so there are balls in the air. There are things very much afoot as these 15 chapters end. And of course, I want to know what you all thought of them, especially quite a few of you who are reading this book for the first time. There are doubts that are raised. Bingley's sister, for instance, raises significant doubts about the stories that Mr. Wickham has told about himself. Bingley's circle, the circle of friends that surround Darcy, clearly don't believe that he is a bad person, much less the totally iniquitous person that Wickham describes. And Wickham describes that totally iniquitous person constantly saying the whole time that he's doing it that he really can't judge, that it really, don't mind me, I really shouldn't even be saying this. Every appearance of it being dragged out of him involuntarily. Very convincingly done. We've all been there, BookTube. We've all been there. We were all swept off our feet by that charming, smooth-talking memento mori. We've all had BookTube's equivalent of with Mr. Wickham in our lives, haven't we? And so the 15 chapters that we read today involve mostly disappointment. This is a, I guess you could call it a dark passage in Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth's hopes with Mr. Wickham have been dashed. For instance, a young woman named Mrs. King suddenly inherits £10,000, and suddenly Wickham's attentions are turned to her and away from Elizabeth. And Elizabeth professes to be intellectually unsurprised by this. He has no means. Of course he's going to want to attach himself to an heiress of such staggering fortune. But nevertheless, she is serially heartbroken throughout these chapters. Mrs. Bennet, of course, is broken by the fact that Elizabeth is not going to marry someone who has a roof to put over her head. Charlotte Lucas she gets that roof, she gets that comfortable living, but there's no illusion about what she's sacrificing for it, and that's fairly horrifying. And the worst hammer blow of all is that the magical connection that we saw develop between Bingley and Jane seems to be dashed, seems to be ended. And those are the 15 chapters that we're reading today. So I'm wondering what you made of it all. These are curveballs. And those of you who have never read Pride and Prejudice, much less any other Regency romances, that all the innumerable subgenre of Regency romances were all born in this book. If you haven't read any of those, then a lot of these things that have become conventions are going to surprise you. So did they surprise you? And what did you make of it all? Did you think, were you laughing at any parts? There are quite a few. There's quite a bit of comedy in these chapters too. I don't mean to draw them as black. And then we will move on next Sunday for our continued mandatory read-along. Okay? Mandatory. Next Sunday we'll do the next 15 chapters. We're just going to finish this up. So we're not finishing next week. Next week we get to some of the high points of the novel, and one of my favorite moments in all of English literature comes next week. So we will re-adjourn then, and in the meantime, as usual, fill the comments feed with tell me everything that you thought about these next 15 chapters. That is the principal joy of these read-alongs for me. So I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.